So welcome everybody. I would like to welcome you to tonight's event. My name is Mel Brown and I'm the Community Engagement Librarian at Sustainability at Hobsons Bay Libraries. I would like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are, we live, work and play on Aboriginal land. My life is lived in Naarm on the lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be present with us tonight. Aboriginal sovereignty of this land was never ceded and the impact of colonisation is ongoing. I spend my work days looking out to the bay on the lands of the Bunurong, and I follow the bends of the Corrick Creek to my home on Wurundjeri country. As I walk this land today, I do so knowing that this country has been walked and cared for millennia before me, and I open myself to hear the stories, those full of joy, wisdom and wonder, but also those of sorrow, heartbreak and loss. I embrace the culture and wisdom of my home, and I walk alongside my Indigenous brothers and sisters to a fairer Australia. For those of you in the audience tonight, if you know whose country you are on, I do encourage you to pop it in the chat. And if you don't, I would encourage you to find out if you can. Thank you for joining us this evening. For tonight's event, we do welcome you to have your cameras on. We will be recording, and as I've said, for those of you who are here before I hit record, we're going to record the first part of the session tonight, and then for those of you who are watching later, we haven't actually recorded the guest questions at the end. So we've got the first part available for all to be able to watch after, but this guest Q&A is a bit of a special for those of you who have logged in tonight. So I am going to ask everyone to stay mute during the main part of tonight, and then at the end you're welcome to turn your microphones off, turn your microphones on, cameras on, and we can have a bit of a chat for the second part of the session tonight. So tonight's event is being brought to you by the Enviro Centre. A quick reminder that we are closed to come in and browse at the libraries, but we are open for click and collect books and also printing Monday to Friday 10 till 4 and your normal branch weekend opening hours. Our phones are still available Monday to Friday 9 till 5 as well, and those normal weekend opening hours too, with the exception of Newport, which is currently still closed while it's being utilised as DHHS as a vaccination centre. So if Newport is your normal branch, give us a call. We can arrange for your click and collect books to be transferred to your next closest branch. So we're being joined tonight by Brooke McAlary, co-host of the Slow Your Home podcast, author of Destination Simple, Slow, and the new release, Care, the radical art of taking time. I'm going to pop the links in the chat to reserve the book on our catalogue, but also to our local independent bookseller, Book and Paper, who have kindly got some extra copies in. If anybody wants to purchase that one as well, you can do that through Book and Paper. So tonight's session is going to be in conversation style as we work through some questions that I have prepared. We have left time for audience questions as well, so get yourself comfortable while we start delving into the idea of how we can care in smaller ways for ourselves, our loved ones and our communities, and discover that caring doesn't need to cost us our well-being. A little bit of an intro about Brooke. As well as being a podcaster and an author, Brooke is a self-proclaimed tree hugger, mountain lover, moderately successful gardener. She lives in the Southern Highlands in New South Wales with her husband Ben, 2 kids, 2 dogs, lots of fruit trees, many wild birds who eat the said fruit trees, and a spider named Fred. I love that you put the spider in there, can I just say that? But can you please join me in welcoming Brooke McAlary?
Thank you, Mel. Fred needed to get a mention.
I have, when I read that, I laughed because I have a beautiful golden orb weaving spider last summer and I named her Shirley. So I love that Fred got it into the book. And if I ever manage to write myself a book, I will make sure Shirley gets into those acknowledgements as well.
They deserve it.
So let's get started. I feel like it's quite odd to hear your voice and see your face as well. And that's because I've been listening to your podcast for a very long time. So it's really unnerving to be able to see you when I'm normally just used to listening. But for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of listening to you for as long as I have, and who aren't familiar with your story, before we get into the new book, can you give us a bit of a recap on the life experience that brought you here, publishing a book on how we can all care for ourselves and our world around us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if I rewind about 10 years, pre, slow living movement, myself being involved in the slow living movement, I was the opposite of slow in every way, every way you could possibly imagine. I was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle. I had 2 very young children and ran a business, and my husband worked insanely long hours, and we were deeply in debt, and, add on all of the things that make a really stressful kind of existence where we thought we were doing all the things that we should have been doing in order to be successful. And when our second baby was only a couple of months old, it all came crashing down around my ears, and I was diagnosed with severe postnatal depression. And long, messy story short, that was sort of the catalyst for me discovering the idea of slow and intentional living. But it was actually my psychiatrist who introduced it to me, because I would go into my sessions with her and I would basically complain about how busy I was and how I never got a chance to enjoy my life because of all the things I had to do. And I think I would just go in and repeat myself every session over and over again. And one day she just asked me, well, have you considered doing less? I'm like, no, that's not an option. That's not something you can do, is it? And I was somewhat offended, actually, by the suggestion, because I thought what she was saying was that I wasn't able to cope, with the pace of life, and I was deficient in some capacity. And of course, that's not at all what she was saying. And she just let it sort of go. And the idea stuck with me to the point where I found myself a couple of days later still mulling over this idea of, well, can I do less? Can I actively choose to live differently? And I Googled it. How can I simplify my life? And I landed on a blog about simple living and minimalism. And that was sort of the entry point for me into, I guess, the sort of lifestyle shift I've made over the last decade, which started out with simplifying, decluttering, and has gradually morphed into where I find myself now, where it's not so much about decluttering at physical or, dealing with the ownership of stuff anymore. It's more about the ripples of change that the actions that we make in our lives can have. And that's really kind of, I guess, the crux of care, and how I landed there, I think.
Did you ever think you'd end up writing a book about that journey?
No. My goodness, no. I started blogging, and my sister read it, and probably my dad read it, and that was it. And it was more like an online journal. I don't know. Everyone was blogging. It seemed like a fun thing to do. And it started with me like writing about, how to organize the landing strip in your home, and, how to make sure you don't have food that goes off in your fridge, and all that kind of life hacky stuff that was fine. It was, helpful in its own way, but it was very surface level. And then I remember one day I wrote about my own experiences of postnatal depression. And that was the moment that people started to connect with what I had been writing. And I think it took me a long time. It took me many years to process it. But that's when I realized that people are really craving these conversations about, the realities of changing the way that we live, and what it actually looks like in a real life to figure out your values and then create a life around them. It's not easy, and it's not pretty. It's actually very messy sometimes. But that was, I think, when I landed on the idea that maybe there is something here worth exploring. And the podcast came as an extension of that, because it gave me a completely different way to explore what slow looks like, because, as you know, it looks one of a million ways, and for everyone it looks different.
And I think, your honesty very much comes across in what you do, in how you present your podcast and your book. I'm actually going to skip down a couple of questions that I had because it leads in perfectly, and it's about your writing style or your podcasting style, and it's about the personal nature. And I think, I know that's what resonated for me when I listened. When I listen to you or when I read your books, it feels like it's an old friend is talking to me, or a letter from somebody's being written. But laying yourself so bare must have been pretty scary at the start. And I'm just wondering, was it something that came deliberately? Is it something that evolved over time? And how do you feel about it now?
That is a juicy question. Yeah, so it came naturally in only that I didn't know any other way of doing it. I don't come from a journalism background, so I only have ever written as like an angst-fueled teenager or, a journaler. So I didn't have that skill set that would allow me distance. And every time I tried, it didn't ring true. So it became really clear to me pretty early on, even when I was just blogging, that I needed to set some boundaries around what I did and didn't share. And people will say to me all the time, you share so much. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, yes, I do. But everything that I share is something that I've already processed, so and moved forward from. And I think for me, I would run into some significant mental health trouble if I was sharing stuff like in the heat of the moment. And that's something that I'm really grateful for having established pretty early on. In saying that, though, the writing the way that I do does take a toll. Like I won't lie. It's I feel like I'm like laying myself bare in some ways. And even though that is in a controlled, intentional way, it still does sort of lead to a lot of anxiety dreams in the lead up to a book coming out, and lots of deep conversations with my husband and my psychologist sometimes too. But in short, I don't know how to do it any other way. And I do genuinely believe that it's important for us to have honest conversations. And if I'm able to be someone who's having an honest conversation in public, on the podcast or through my writing, then that's something that I can offer. And I know that would have helped me enormously back in the day when I was struggling and I thought I was the only one.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that bit. I guess one area where you seem to make balance with is around your children. Mm-hmm. Like I was thinking about it early time. Like I feel like you tell stories about them, but never about them. Like yes. they're always a little bit separate. And I was like, I don't even know their names, and please don't say their names. But it was just that, and so you've obviously carved out some areas that are areas that are kind of no-go zones. Was that a deliberate choice to keep things separate?
Yeah, that was definitely. And that was a deliberate choice made really early on because my kids were little when I first started writing publicly, like a baby and a toddler. So, and I feel like that was the era of blogging in like the mainstream where people were putting their entire family life and everything on online, which is great. And I met loads of people through the blogging world who existed on that spectrum, from both ends of that spectrum. But it was something that I just made the decision on pretty early. And I like that. And I'm really grateful for having set that boundary early on, because it feels like when I write about stuff that is, emotional or that's personal or, that I feel like may be helpful, I know that there's a whole massive chunk of my life that doesn't ever have to go through that process of being distilled and kind of polished.
And it's probably, looking back now, your kids were really young. It's something you probably could have got away with at the time, but now that they're going into preteen, you can imagine it was a good decision to make at the time.
Well, you know, you do, like, my kids are in year 5 and 6, so they do a lot of online safety and all of that sort of stuff, and they learn whatever's online is there for life. And, you know, so at least I don't have to, you know, do some fancy footwork around my decisions.
Okay, let's get back to the book. I want to talk about care and the notion of self-care. Self-care can often get a bit of a bad rep. It's criticised for being for the privileged, for the entitled. Can you explain to us what this book is about, how you handle that criticism, and why it's so important that we kind of continue down that line?
It's funny, this book actually started out as so pre-COVID, as an investigation into the self-care industry, because I found myself so frustrated that the vast majority of what passes for self-care now is inaccessible to the majority of people for loads of different reasons. You know, financial access, ability, physical ability, you name it. There are so many obstacles and roadblocks that will leave the majority of people out of that self-care conversation. And that frustrated me because the benefits of true self-care are enormous, and they are not actually self-centered at all, you know. So that set me on the path of looking at the roots of self-care and what it started out as. And I do go into this in the book a little bit. And self-care was initially something that doctors and psychologists introduced to patients who were institutionalized. And it was things like building up skills for personal hygiene, hair brushing, you know, brushing their teeth, being able to dress themselves, in literally the sense of being able to care for themselves in some capacity and have that independence and you know, that ability to look after themselves in some ways. And in the 70s, the idea of self-care was adopted by the Black Panther Party in the States, because they were representative of an entire community of people who were being underserved in healthcare and social care and welfare. And the Black Panther Party took it as one of their major tenets and said, well, no one's going to care for us, so we need to care for ourselves. And that was actually, I guess, the birth of community care in the sense that we know now. So, you know, really digging back into the roots of self-care was very instructive, because I realized how far we have come away from that, you know, in 2021, where it's social media and it's hashtags and it's, you know, it's stuff, and it's mostly stuff and products that and services that make us feel bad about ourselves and then tell us that we can fix ourselves and then we'll feel better. So I knew that I needed to kind of dig into that side of it in the book. But I also recognize that what self-care is actually incredibly helpful and important and healing. So it was about, how do I differentiate, I guess, between, you know, self-care that is self-centered, self-entitled, and is only kind of exclusively for the self, and then self-care that allows us to feel that sense of connection to self, and the waves and ripples that come out of that are that we become more engaged community members, we become more engaged family members, our relationships improve. And I guess I landed on the idea of the spectrum of care, because I started rewriting the book when I was very burnt out, as I'm sure many people were last year. You know, Black Summer bushfires, and then COVID, and some personal stuff going on. And I realized that one day I couldn't get out of bed, essentially. And this was, I think, on the heels of probably 2 months of the worst of COVID, you know, the beginning of COVID, where we were all just so overwhelmed. And I don't know about anyone listening, but I was constantly updating my phone, my feeds, reading through every newspaper I could find, you know, trying to be a good citizen and be informed. And then there was one morning where I just couldn't get up, and I realized I was completely burnt out. So what I did was try and focus my efforts into self-care, because I thought, well, that will fix me. You know, I'll feel much better if I focus all that time and energy on self-care. And it did, to a certain extent. But it was also kind of a bit empty. So I realized that there was this massive space in between big care, you know, global overwhelming global issues, climate change, social injustice, COVID, that, you know, those things that are super important but also incredibly overwhelming. And then we've got self-care, what's in the middle? And I landed on small care, which is really the guts of the book.
And the book, for those of you who haven't read it, is, I can see my post-it notes as I went through making notes for tonight's event, and for general pleasure, because it is it the book that you needed to read?
Yes. I, you know, in short, that's what I could have just said. I ended up writing the book that I needed, you know, and I think it was a very almost universal experience to find out, like, our hearts hurting last year and this year, you know, with the heaviness of everything that surrounds us, you know, globally. And yeah, it's absolutely the book that I needed. But they tell you to write a book with a person in mind. I just wrote it with myself in mind accidentally.
Oh, I love that even more. I want to touch on the chapter on play. And I feel like this just epitomizes your honesty in the book. You start the book with, I was nervous to write this chapter. Is that it? Am I quoting it correctly? I was nervous to write this chapter. And you go on to talk about the reason why. Can you tell us quickly about why you were nervous to write it and why you still felt you needed to put it in, and why you think, look, I think play is something, reading this, it resonated with everything that you know, sometimes as adults we forget how to do those things. It's something that a lot of other books don't cover. So it was something that I really wanted to kind of touch on tonight, your relationship with play and how that's changed.
Yeah, it's interesting how many people have had similar reactions. And I think there's something there, because, I mean, the reason that I included play was because it made me so uncomfortable. You know, I think I'm a great believer in a certain level of discomfort, particularly when we're, you know, casting out, net out, and, you know, in discovery mode. A particular level of discomfort is a good sign that there's something there worth exploring. And I got super nervous when I started, you know, pitching about these ideas for including play. But the reason was I'm not the fun parent, you know, I'm not the playful parent. My husband's the playful one. He's the one he'll tackle the kids in the surf and jump on the trampoline with them, and I can't do that. And, you know, it became part of my identity, not one that I was particularly proud of, but it was just like, oh, well, you know, I'm a mum now. I don't get to be the fun one. And then I started having conversations with people, most of them parents, who found themselves in a similar boat. And I had one of these particular conversations with my brother-in-law one morning when we were at a water park. We'd taken our kids to the water park, and we were standing there in the sun talking about how unplayful we were. And then I realized later that we had that conversation lining up for a water slide. And our kids weren't with us. Like, it was just him and me going on a water slide. And I thought, you know, that's play. Fun is play. It's just, I think as a parent, I had fallen into the trap of thinking that I wasn't playful because playing with my kids didn't feel like fun. It didn't feel like play for me. So that was really the place I jumped off, I guess, into my investigation of what play really is. And the thing that's really cool about play is that even the people who study it, even all the psychologists who study it, can't agree on a definition of play because it looks so different to everybody. You know, my husband plays golf for fun, and I think that that's the most boring thing in the world. But, you know, that's fine. It works for him. But play is defined as something that is needless. And playing with my kids, I did it because I wanted to improve our relationship. I knew it was good for their development. I knew that, you know, their bond together would improve and change and evolve in a positive way because of it. That's not needless. So playing with my kids was not actually play for me. And that was a huge moment for me to realize that do it because it's, you know, it's important, but don't think that there's anything wrong with you because you don't necessarily find that the most joyful thing. Sometimes, forgive me, it feels like a chore. And
there goes that honesty again.
Again, I don't know how to do it any other you know, so that kind of gave me permission to go, well, when was the last time that I felt that childlike wonder or that sense of joy or that, you know, that tingly, giddy sort of feeling that you get? And that was a really interesting sort of exercise in saying, well, you know, I really love going on roller coasters, and playing hide and seek is actually genuinely fun for me. I like, you know, creative play. I love like writing is play for me sometimes. And really kind of opening up the definition of play has meant that I now have a lens of play through which I can view things. And that has made all the difference because, you know, I guess I have always been the one who would, like, if you have two possible reactions to a comment, mine would usually be the more earnest one, not the more kind of lighthearted one. And even recognizing that is there's playfulness there in, you know, how I choose to react to situations has been helpful, and I feel lighter for it.
So I've spoken a little bit about play. So your book is broken up into 9 chapters, and those chapters are different components of care. How did you decide, so I've spoken a bit about play, how did you decide on what to put in? Like you said, it changed a little bit after COVID happened and the book changed, but why did you decide on those components, and which ones, like, are there any that you feel that are bigger than others, or do you feel like they all have equal weight? Obviously, some are going to resonate with different readers and what others will, but what made you decide?
Yeah, I think at the core of the book was this idea of accessibility for everyone. Like, my goal is that everybody could pick this book up and find something, some suggestion, some act of care that was relevant and accessible to them. So that was incredibly important to me. And I think that was probably the first filter through which I passed the 9 core ideas of small care, making sure that it felt well-rounded, you know, regardless of who was reading the book. But beyond that, I was really led mostly by intuition and my own personal experiences and where I felt the gaps. You know, the first chapter is connection, and that was very intentionally put first because I think it is so vital. And I think writing through COVID also highlighted that. You know, I'm super introverted and very, very happily would stay in my own company 99% of the time. But even I felt that distinct lack of connection, which was the invitation that I needed to dig a little deeper and find out just how social we are as human beings, and why connection is quite genuinely vital to, you know, our well-being, our sense of happiness, our sense of belonging, and you know, everything else really in small and large ways ties back to the idea of connection. So I think that is probably one of the bigger ones. Rest is another really big one, and that is put towards the end of the book. I think that our relationship with rest is fraught. So again, that sense of discomfort was a guide for me. I think the short answer is that things that make me uncomfortable I wrote about.
And I'm sure for all of those reading, we appreciate that you wrote about them despite the discomfort.
Well, that's good. Yeah, but it's a great question. And I think that there were some that came through conversation with other people as well as I started to talk about the book. And, you know, I had a conversation with my publisher, and she's like, movement was something that she and I came up with together. And I had been really hesitant to write the healing chapter as well, because I didn't want the book to fall into the category of complete woo. So I didn't want it to be all about yoga and meditation, and as wonderful as those things are, and I practice them myself, but I think that's what people expect out of this particular kind of book. So initially that wasn't going to make it. And then I realized, well, there is scientific evidence that shows us why these things are so powerful and important. And I think we all need, practices in healing. So it was sort of convincing myself that that was a valid thing to include as well. And I think that was the last chapter I wrote in the end.
It's interesting you say that. We had Jade Miles on the for our event last month, and she was saying a very similar thing about when she put ritual into her book. She was unsure about, because of that blend over. And I think, it's I think sometimes we get so concerned about where to draw that line that some things get missed out on that are really important to include. Absolutely.
Exactly. And I think, like those things are allowed to take up space. They have value. It's just not in a capitalist sense,
Absolutely. So your comment before about connection, I think at the start of COVID, we all saw there was almost like this overwhelming, like people were helping their neighbours out and their community out, and people were also going out into nature a lot more, and they were out, like I know my local creek had, dogs came out of the woodwork that I didn't think there was anywhere near that many dogs in my suburb as came out during COVID. And obviously we're back in lockdown in Melbourne again now, and they're all back again. We kind of ebb and flow. We go into lockdown and people tap into these things, and then lockdown seems to end and we shift so quickly back. What's your take on that? And why, we're obviously craving these things. We're looking for them.
Yeah.
Until there's a distraction.
Right. And I think I had a conversation with someone on the podcast actually yesterday about this. And she said she used to find that she initially found that really hard to take. She's like, but we can do it. We can spend more time in nature. We can connect as a community and, show up in kindness. And then we get that sense of like normal back and we shift. And I think to a certain extent, it's just human nature. We go back to comfort. We go back to the familiar. But I think the wonderful thing about it is that those experiences, we can't unhave them, and they plant seeds in us, seeds of like self-understanding. Maybe, some of those dog owners on some subconscious level realize that their mental health is improved when they spend time in nature. And, sure, they may kind of rush back to normal life for a while, but that seed might gradually, grow in them. And over time, they might become an avid bushwalker or a bird watcher. So I think that even if we try and convince ourselves that we can go back to normal, we can't, because we can't unhave the experiences that the last 2 years have given us for good and bad. And I think it's sort of a time, it's going to be a really interesting time over the next 12 months, but I think it's also a time to be patient with ourselves and allow space to reflect on what we have learned. Because as I said, I really do think it's human nature to want to go back to what was comfortable or to what we knew. And it's just going to take a little bit of time and space to really think on it and develop some like language and understanding around it, and to really see how fundamentally things have changed.
We're going to stick with the nature chapter for a bit here. It's a chapter that resonated really strongly with me. I often go out bushwalking, hiking down my local creek, and being in the Enviro Centre, let's tap into this. I have to comment on your writing in the book about your addiction to the game Heyday, and I laugh at that because my addiction was to Farmville, which was a very similar game. For those of you who don't know, they were like computer games that you played on your phone, or phone or a laptop, and you would plant a crop, and then depending on the crop, 10 or 30 minutes or an hour later, you'd come back and you'd harvest them. And at the time, they were huge games. Everybody was playing them. They were very popular. And it kind of got me thinking about the underlying psyche of society, that we were playing games that we're connecting us to nature in a very unnatural way, and that idea that sometimes as a society we almost reject or resist the nature, or we go, I live in suburbia, there's no nature around me. Like we look at nature as being something you need to get in your car and drive to. Like it's something, it's a place you go or an adventure you have, not something we can have at home. And so I'm wondering what you think on how we can reconnect with nature around us and accept ourselves as being part of that nature as well, rather than separate from it.
Yeah, and I think the first step is to just recognize that language that you highlighted. We see ourselves consciously or otherwise as separate to nature. We go visit nature. We go spend time in nature. We don't think of ourselves as part of that. We don't think of our bodies as nature, or the air that we breathe, or the water we drink. And I think that is a fundamental shift that we can all make regardless of where we live. And that allows us to tap into all of the tiny pockets of nature that exist either in our homes. Like I'm just looking, I've got another window spider in the window next to me. That's nature. That spider is building this beautiful web and eating flies. And I think that recognizing that is something like a part of the system that we're all a part of is a really unifying and beautiful sort of realization to make, but it also frees us up to think of virtually anything not man-made as nature. And I write about like soil. Everyone would walk past or look out and see a patch of dirt at some point in their day, or a weed, or some little wildflower that's just hanging on to the roof of the apartment building next to you, whatever it might be. There is always something that we can see. And I think learning to look at our world through a lens of noticing, and through that lens of like noticing nature in particular, is another way of doing that. But one of the ideas that I talk about in the book that is really very simple, but I think also quite transformative, is to find a sit spot. And a sit spot is just a spot to sit in nature or with a view of nature. And if you allow yourself, 2 minutes on your lunch break, or if you have a front step to your house where you can see a tree, that can be a sit spot. You don't need to go off into the bush to find this sort of special place. By showing up day in and day out, or week in and week out, to this one sit spot and allowing yourself a couple of minutes to just notice things, you start seeing patterns. You recognize when the flowers bloom and when the colors of the leaves turn, and what birds live in that tree, or if there's ever bees around. And as you do that, you begin to feel yourself becoming part of that place. And I think the follow-on to that, which excites me a lot, is that as we begin to feel a part of a place, we also begin to feel a responsibility for a place. And I think that there's a really powerful shift waiting to happen there for a lot of us, in developing a sense of responsibility and connection to place. And you don't have to go off, and camp over the weekend, or, find some remote corner of a national park. You can do it in the local park. You can do it with a pot plant. You can do it with virtually any space that has, green or nature or air or birds. Actually, that reminds me of the definition of nature that I use in the book, and it's something that I found in the Nature Fix. But I think it's a Ernest Hemingway quote that nature is where birds fly around uncooked. That really opens it up.
I think it's Oscar Wilde.
Oh, sorry, it is Oscar Wilde.
And it's such a great quote. And the Nature Fix that you mentioned from Florence Williams, fantastic read that we have in the Enviro Centre as well. So great book. I have been playing with 2 sit spots. I kind of decide on one, and then after a week or two, I'm like, oh no, this is what's boring. I'm going to try a different one. And then I realized, no, just stay long enough so that you start to realize what's going on. And I was just moving on too quickly because I was expecting something to change, something to be different, and I just had to get out of my head sometimes and stop.
Very human of us, though, like, and very modern human. Everything moves so quickly. We're like, well, come on, at the moment, lots of blossoms are starting to burst into bloom and stuff around here, but I feel myself. I've planted a whole heap of seeds in my garden on the weekend. It's only Wednesday, and I'm like, come on, seedlings, emerge, grow, bloom. And it's really and the antidote to instant gratification, spending time in nature, is like, there's no clocks in nature, and everything will happen as it needs to happen, not on our timeline. So I think it's important to find a sit spot that you enjoy, though, too. So don't beat yourself up too much.
I'm lucky that I've got a creek literally minutes from my door. So but I realized after about a week, it's like, oh no, the birds will come back once they realize that I'm not a threat. Like, it was just that as soon as I sat down, that all disappeared. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about eco-anxiety, or like this kind of idea of compassion fatigue. I think a lot of people kind of reject or resist the problems facing the world preemptively, because they, if I start caring, how do I not care so much? And as I was thinking about this, I got thinking about David Attenborough, and when he started incorporating conservation issues and climate change into his documentaries, he was hit with a lot of criticism, like, no, keep just showing us the wonder and the awe of the world. We don't want to know about the issues. And this idea that, do we sometimes protect ourselves so that we don't have to face them? But if we all cared evenly, then that care would be distributed amongst us all. But how can we get people to join that conversation with us? And obviously, your chapter on connection, but it's just wondering what ideas you had around getting people into that conversation.
Yeah, I think initially, the most important thing is recognizing that we all feel like that. Even the most, again, the woman I spoke with yesterday is quite a well-known activist. And so you would look at her and she's very positive and really engaged and joyful and magnetic in her work. And it would be really easy to think that stuff doesn't weigh heavily on her because she's somehow developed this skill set to not feel crushed by things. And, we spoke at length about how that's not the case at all. So I was curious to find out what she did to sort of try and, just in a personal sense, manage some sense of balance between caring really big and outwardly and in ways that kind of leave her heart vulnerable, and caring for her heart. And, she spoke about lots of different practices. She started trail running and she likes to spend time with her daughter and, milking her goats and, finding those moments of complete sort of mindlessness in terms of allowing herself to daydream and be creative for no reason. And those things over time, she's able to look at things from a 10,000 foot view. There's balance there, but there are days when things feel really heavy, and then there are days where she really sort of retreats. And I think that we need to not feel like we have to have the answer all the time. There's going to be times where we have a lot to give, and there's going to be times where we have very little to give. And I think that's maybe the conversation we have with our people is, I will step up when I can, and I will help you when I can. And the idea of the social contract of reciprocity is that you will also do the same for me. So how do you have that conversation? I write a little bit about the Tahitian word few in the book, which is something that I wish would be adopted worldwide, but I don't think it's going to happen. But essentially, if you are burnt out, if you are overwhelmed, if you are sick, if you're running on empty, you can say, I'm few, and everyone understands that that means you need time away. It means you need time to rest, to heal, and it is a completely acceptable reason to shut your store, to not come to work, to take a week off. And the reason it works is because it's reciprocal. The person that you say it to knows that there will be a time where they are feeling completely burnt out and they're able to honestly say, I need some time, and people will step in. So, you know, that's the social contract that I'd love to see. But what if we just had those micro conversations with our people and said, well, what would it look like for me to help you, you know, once a week? You know, could I take your kids so you could go for a walk? Could you cook a meal for me every 2 weeks and I'll stick half of it in the freezer? Like, and just allowing ourselves to be human in sometimes we've got more to give than other times. Because I think we feel like we need to have it all together, even if we say we don't think we do. But I think often we do. You know, we're very scared to admit that we don't necessarily have all the answers.
If there's anything that I've been talking to people about your book, it's been that concept of few, and I love it. So I'm all for making that a worldwide movement.
Well, it starts with us, Mel.
We can do it, absolutely. For guests that are out there, start thinking about your questions, because I've only got a couple more, and then I'm going to hand over to everyone that's logged in tonight. I would love for you to give us a bit of a story. Tell us about your dishcloth and how that one simple little item created ripples for you and your family and the people around you, because I think it's a great example of how one small thing can spread.
Yeah, so I decided a couple of years ago that I wanted to learn how to crochet. I tried knitting. I made a couple of like lumpy scarves previously to that, but knitting really stressed me out. I
just say that because I'm the complete opposite.
Lots of conversations with people who are like, you don't make sense. But I went to the op shop and I'm like, well, I'm not going to spend any money on this new hobby that may or may not stick. So I bought myself some horrible twine and a plastic hook and took some tutorials off YouTube. And I learned gradually how to just do basic crochet. And I thought, well, I want to make something. I want this to be worth something, which is, again, something we could dig into over and over again, but you know, regardless. And I thought, well, I could probably make a dishcloth, which is essentially just a square of crochet. So I did. And I cannot tell you how proud I was of this one tiny, lumpy, uneven square of crocheted cotton twine. Because it was a thing that I had made and it was useful and I could see that it had a life cycle. You know, I'd use it in the kitchen and wash it and reuse it and wash it. And then once it became a little too holy, I could use it for cleaning. And then once like it was more whole than rag, I could put it in the compost, you know. And that sort of opened my eyes to the soulfulness of handmade things and the power of taking time to put your energy into making things, which sounds very obvious until you start to really unpack what that looks like. You know, I think that I have developed a much stronger sense of gratitude and I guess like the work, like the human work that goes into making things is something that should be valued. Whereas in throwaway culture, we don't tend to do that. You know, clothes are worn a few times and then they're lobbed off to the op shop or to, you know, thrown away. We don't value making. So it taught me then the importance of repair and looking after the stuff that I did have, because the resources and time that went into that, they're not nothing, they're important, you know. And the ripples kind of reached out from there. And one of the ones that really did surprise me was that my kids would see me make stuff. It's like dishcloths, not stuff. And they were impressed by that you could, you know, take time and take these kind of separate ingredients and with a bit of effort, turn it into something. And I think that is something that probably the last couple of generations really hasn't seen a lot of in general. You know, my mum, when I was really little, would make my clothes, but then clothes got cheap and it, you know, she got busy and it was much easier to just buy them than make them. So it was really cool to be able to recognize the impact that had on my kids when they asked me to show them how to crochet. Yeah, that didn't really stick, but regardless, just to have that conversation with them, and to recognize that things don't just burst forth from the earth, you know, fully formed. Time and effort and resources go into it. And I think, yeah, if nothing else, we just need to look after the stuff that we've got.
Thank you very much, Brooke. I was about to say, for the last 18 months, I've never done that on an event. Oh, my record has been blown. Oh, that's so embarrassing.
A little bit.
First time. That idea of repairing and mending, which is having a beautiful resurgence at the moment, realizing the value of the resources, the time, the labor when you're buying things, and that kind of consumerism that when things are cheap, you don't think about what you're throwing out. You don't think about what you're bringing in, because if you don't use it, you don't wear it, you don't like it, you can throw it out. So it's a lovely reminder for us all that that, you know, things take up space and time and resources, all to get them in our hand, on our bodies.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing is like making, because that's one of the chapters, one of the core ideas is making. That can apply to so many other things as well, right? Like it can be food, it can be a garden, it can be like growing food, it can be baking a cake. And it ties so beautifully in with the idea of sharing and kindness, because I think that was one of the other big shifts that came from my tiny little dishcloths, was that my family was like, they heard me banging on about my dishcloth. And they're like, that sounds cool. Could you make me one? You know, and I made a stack for my family. And that, we don't know where the impact of those tiny little actions leads. And I think it was a really cool example of the power of a small change, and, you know, the potential that it has to reach a lot further than you could imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I have started making my own just bench tops sanitizer using old citrus rinds, and that was just one thing I kind of chucked together. And then from there, it's like, oh, what can I do next, and what can I do next? And now I've kind of got a whole range of things that I make at home myself from that kind of one idea at the start. So it definitely can expand, and that rolling effect. So my last question for tonight, before we head over to the audience, different parts of your book will resonate with everyone. There's quite a bit in there, very different topics. If there was one thing that you would want everybody to take away from your book, what would that one thing be?
The power of awe, I think. So awe is, now, or like, sounds ridiculous. Awe is awe-inspiring, but like the genuine power of experiencing awe is phenomenal, and it's something that that is available to all of us. So when I say awe, I mean that goosebumpy feeling that you get, you know, something that shifts the way that you think about yourself in relation to the world, or you know, your perception of the world. And if we experience awe, and that can be something as small as paying attention to our heartbeat for, you know, 30 seconds and thinking about how it is a constant in our life until it's not, you know, and like that combination of wonder and fear is what makes awe so powerful, because it really shifts our perception of ourselves in the world. And you know, there's loads of scientific evidence showing that people who experience awe, even something as small as that, are more patient, they're more cooperative, they're more generous, and they have a sense of having more time in their lives when they actually have the same amount that they had previously. And I think that if you look at the world, if you look where we've kind of landed at the moment, and the things that are so stressful and upsetting, like having more patience, having more kindness and connection and collaboration and more time would really kind of soothe a lot of souls. So I think that everyone has something massive to gain from practicing a moment of awe every day.
I love that. I'd never really thought much about awe until you started talking about it on your podcast. And then I think I realized that I was looking out, seeking awe without actually even realizing that I was seeking it. But then once I recognized that that was what I was doing, it's like I realized where it was around me all the time, and I was always looking out for it. I just had never put a name on what it was that I was looking for before. So we are going to turn off the recording now. Before we do so, I do want to thank Brooke. We are going to continue, but I just want to make sure that everyone who's watches it later can see that we have really thanked Brooke for her time tonight. It's been, as I said, like, for listening to you for so long, it's really nice to be able to have a two-way conversation. It's been really lovely. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you. It's been a genuine delight.
I have popped the links in the chat to the catalogue to reserve the book, but also to Book and Paper, our local independent bookseller. But I'm going to stop the recording now, and we're going to turn over